Welcome to Tanakh Talk. I'm your host, William Hall, broadcasting live out of Kingsland, Texas, USA, with a special broadcast, a follow-up from Jerusalem with my dear holy brother, Gavriel Sanders. Some missing pieces that if you saw the first video, you're not going to want to miss. So thank you all for tuning in. Gavriel, my holy brother, thank you so much for joining us here. It's always a pleasure having you here in any way we can possibly get you. So thank you so much.
Well, there's a picture of me in the post office from other people that want to get me, I guess so.
Oh, no, it's not America's Most Wanted, I hope.
I'm amongst America's least wanted. So it was at the bottom of the bulletin board there. So
not according to our studio. You're like one of the most wanted in our studio.
Well, it's very kind of you to say that. My low self-esteem really appreciates it. So you just saved me 175 in therapy. So thanks for that, and all you Tanakh Talk watchers. Thanks for contributing to the betterment of my soul. It's let me the clock here. It's about 1:24 in the morning according to my body, even though it's 6:24 at this live recording that we're doing, and in New York where I am.
And it's actually 5:24 here. You're definitely a trooper. You just finished a really amazing visit to Israel, and I have to tell you, for all the viewers out there who's tuning in for the first time, who was not privy to the first set of viewers who saw what was going on there, that was an absolutely delightful, to say the least, event that I was watching. I had the privilege of, thanks to Shannon, a big shout out to Shannon Newsom for helping setting this whole thing up, and it was really amazing to see four very familiar faces, yours being on the top of the list, Rabbi Tovia Singer, Rabbi Moshe Shulman, and Shannon Newsom, all together in the same facility, facilitating a very important thing. And so, but what we're doing today is, and this is what I would like for you to help us out with. Tell us a little bit about your visit there and why we're here tonight.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the work that you put into streaming that live, and thank the viewers for being a part of that community. I have just such a deep-seated affection for the work that Tanakh Talk does.
Thank you.
It's done with a very, very large heart. And we could all work together in order to enlarge the pocket behind doing it, but that's another discussion. Yes, there's a great deal of work to be done in the world today, and we are constituting a community here that is linked through the benefit of the digital resources that are within our reach, and it's amazing, William. I don't want you to get too big ahead over this, but I think it's just amazing what you've been able to consolidate in bringing together some very, I think, dynamic and meaningful content providers here through the platform that you've been able to then, with your technology expertise, and of course the tremendous support of Deanna behind you, to get this thing going. About the trip itself, I hadn't been to Israel in a number of years, which is weird because this trip that I just took was my 15th, but it was a real gap in time between the last trip and this one. I was asked specifically to come by a certain organization called BMensch, which you can look up, bmensch.com. And I was specifically tasked with going last Wednesday to look at an encounter between two of the most polarized communities in Israel. What are those polarized communities? What's known as the Haredi Jews, the ones that are they're often called ultra-Orthodox, which I think is such a stupid term. It's like ultra-Orthodox. What does that mean?
You're doing it the right way. You're doing it the really, really right way.
They brush with ultra-bright. What is this? It's just crazy. So, that's funny. But let's just say very, very observant, but distinct from what we would call the Chardal community, which would be the Haredi Dati Leumi, which if people don't know what those terms mean, like people that are more nationalistic in their orientation. Tanakh observant, Torah observant, but there are a lot of different streams. What's amazing to me about Israel is if you tried to put it together on like a sociological map, it looked like a mosaic or a tapestry. It's just very, very blended with all these different streams, and so people are, I think, much more seem to be more label conscious there than maybe we are here. But I was asked to go by the Be a Bench Foundation to observe an encounter between, the quote ultra and ultra liberal, ultra leftists. And so I was in a high school last week to see this amazing encounter with kids, 10th graders, who'd never met anybody from the Torah observant community. They've met Palestinians that their leftist educators have exposed them to. They've met lots of people who advocate, and I'll just say this in very soft terms, everybody will know what I'm talking about, people who are strong advocates of alternative lifestyles and orientations. But they've never sat down with people who are part of the traditional, what we call the Masorah or the Masorah, part of the unbroken chain of transmission and connectivity, going back to Har Sinai, back to Mount Sinai.
And just to clarify that the Masorah, I get into a lot of Christian dialogues. I won't say debates. I'll just say dialogues with people who want to argue whether it was the ancient Paleo, whether it was Masoretic, or whether it was whatever. And so Masorah literally means handed down, correct?
That's correct.
Okay,
it gets translated as tradition, but it comes from the Hebrew root, which would be masar or masor, in present tense verb masor.
Right.
If I said if I wanted to say to you, timsorli te'et, hand me the pen. Timsorli, limsor, to pass. So it's an interesting word because it implicit within the word is the sense of proximity. I have to be close to you in order for me to hand you something, or you to hand me something, right? Mm-hmm. So there's a spatial proximity in there that we're talking about. But this, when we talk about the Masorah, is really an intergenerational. You can talk about a Talmud and a Rebbe, a student and a rabbi. But the word rabbi or Rebbe is so much closer. I had the privilege of, on Friday morning, of driving up. It was in a hailstorm. I was walking down the street on Ramat Shlomo on top of one of the hills surrounding northern Jerusalem, and in a hailstorm. Me and my coffee cup getting pelted by these hailstones.
Wow.
To go visit my Rebbe, who is Rabbi Avram Davis, who was written a lot of the texts that come from the Matsuda publishing arm. They're interlinear texts mostly. He must be well into his 90s. He should live and be well, and he's still writing books. He's still amazing. So I hadn't seen him face to face for close to 20 years. So we talk every week, and it was just so amazing to connect with him because. My oft quoted phrase and I mentioned it last Thursday, I mentioned it almost every time I talk to anybody, is Aseh lecha rav. This is from the Ethics of the Fathers, from Pirkei Avot, which is Aseh lecha rav uknei lecha chaver. It's my number one top quoted phrase because it embodies so much of what everybody needs in terms of a spiritual relationship. This last week's Parsha, Va'era, talks about that Hashem had called the Jewish people out of the land of Israel. It says, "Hotzeti etchem, hitzalti, hotzeti otam, hitzalti otam." One other thing I'm forgetting. Ga'alti otam, v'lakachti otam. It says, I took them out, I saved them, I redeemed them, and then it says, I took them. There's this hotzeti, which took means take out, and lakachti, which means take. And it says, lakachti otam, to be to me, li la'am, to be to me a people. So the Jewish people were taken out of Egypt to understand and see God in the world and to be to people. These two words, li la'am, 2 words in Hebrew, 4 words in English, to me a people, really embody everything. Because this li, to me, means that's between a person and the Creator. La'am, a people, to be a people, really is then all the different halachas or the different laws that we find, whether it's Noahide or in the Torah for the Jewish people. These are the interpersonal relations, the laws, the principles that govern how we get along together. So that also connects back to the idea of Masorah. Masorah is the environment, the relational environment in which these spiritual transactions take place. So that much I wanted to say. So seeing my beloved Rebbe was just an amazing thing, and I got a nice picture of sometime. I mean, he's wizened now, and he's walks with caution, but he's still a giant in terms of his spirit. And that's one of the amazing things that you find down throughout Jewish history. If you look at the lifespan that these people who often lived very extended lives compared to the general population. People know those days were dying at 30, 40, whatever. If you lived to 50, it was amazing. But you find many people in the Jewish world that live to 80, 90, high 90s. And in times when microbes were much more virulent than what we have today because of drugs, antibiotics, etc. So there's a promise of long life that we find, and we wish each other. We say one of the most famous phrases that we wish somebody on their birthday is, ad mea ve'esrim, ad until
100,
mea 120.
Years, yeah, right.
So there's a little joke we say is, what do you wish somebody on their 120th birthday? Have a nice day. So anyway,
that's the last day you got.
Just a little Orthodox joke
that was awesome. Very nicely played.
So speaking of it, but before we get any further into about last week, etc. Speaking of the word Orthodox, I happened to go to the Feldheim bookstore on Har Nof last Friday, right before they closed, and I don't know if you tell me if you can see this. I see there. This is my little window. I'm holding up this book called The Non-Orthodox. Can you read it out there? Because it's backwards.
I can. Yeah. The Non-Orthodox Jews Guide to Orthodox Jews. Why we do what we do, wear what we wear, and think what we think.
Right. So this is a Feldheim book, which I've wanted to read for some time. It's written by David Baum. You can see his name there.
Yep.
And it's really insightful. And so anyone who's interested in exploring, that side of Jewish living, loving, and learning, you'll find that to be a great resource. And then for people among us as viewers who just plain love the Bible and love to study it, this is a book that came out this last year called Uncovering Sefer Yirmiyahu. Uncovering Sefer Yirmiyahu. Now, Sefer means book, and Yirmiyahu is Jeremiah.
Right.
And this is, an archaeological, geographic. I'm reading it backwards. So
you're doing a great job. Historical perspective by Rabbi Gavriel Sanders. I'm just kidding. Rabbi Yehuda lifted up Landy.
Okay, very good. So these are
awesome.
These are a couple of books. Again, these are Feldheim. These are not art school books, which I normally recognize. But these are really, really good. So if you're interested in archaeology, historical geography, etc.,
nice.
Uncovering Yirmiyahu is a great book to learn. So anyway, as I said to you, I was brought in by the Mensch Foundation to observe, and then while I was there, our friend Shannon Newsom put together the last Thursday night's event at what's called the Pinksker Shul on Pinksker Street. It's hard to say that. Let me have some more water here, and I can.
While you're drinking your water, she is such an amazing soul. I mean, she is so driven to help keep Jews Jewish and to aid people in understanding how to maintain communication on such a delicate level. She's just a really sweet soul, and I'm so glad that she's part of everything that's going on right now.
Well, yeah, it's really great that she's come finally into your orbit. Of course, another fellow Texan, which you can be proud of,
as well as a musician.
yes, that too.
And she's got my heart there already.
She's very involved in.
Right.
She's very, very involved in what's unfolding in Israel these days as the missionary community, which is very connected to the Christian Zionist communities we're going to talk about tonight. Has insinuated itself deeply into Jewish agency and government programs.
Now, were you eavesdropping on an earlier show? Because we literally just had that as a hot topic mention as the Zionism in our culture today. So the fact that you're really just random.
I'm just very, very aware of it.
Wow.
And,
good timing. Good timing.
So you can't talk about Christian Zionist, Christian Zionist, evangelical, missionary, these are really synonymous terms. Now, not all evangelicals are Christian Zionists, but I would say it's pretty safe to say that 98% plus of Christian Zionists are evangelicals. And when we say evangelical, then that it's synonymous with the term missionary. So I guess we really should talk about, that is going back and kind of recapping some of what we said Thursday, but I have other things I want to weave into this. Basically, what is a missionary? Well, what's the first two syllables of the word mission? Somebody who has a mission, somebody who's looking to persuade somebody to another point of view, their point of view. It could be something religious, a doctrine. It could be it could be somebody who wants to convert somebody to their belief system. When we start talking about a Christian missionary, then we're really talking about someone who has first and foremost, and this is always what I used to say, I would say to somebody, religion is man's effort to reach God, but what we're talking about here is a personal relationship with God through his son, who came to this world to be born through a human agency, virgin in this case that is talked about, to live a meritorious and miraculous life, to live the life that none of us are capable of living, to totally fulfill the law, according to Matthew 5. I didn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it, which is, that's what I'm about. I'm about fulfilling the law. So how is that any different? That's another discussion. And then ultimately to die a death on the cross, that it was to be sacrificial and a sacrificial atonement, substitutionary atonement for every person on the planet, past, present, and future. And the missionary, and this is true of nearly all evangelicals, feel a very personal relationship with God through JC. And you know who I'm talking about. This person says, I love the Lord. They paraphrase make songs from the Psalms. I love the Lord because he heard my voice. And a song we used to sing all the time, the church I was in. The person has a strong allegiance relationship to this relationship. And it's focused on bringing others into that sphere of influence as well. And that's really the mindset of the individual. He starts out with the heart, accepting him in the heart. And then over time, the person learns, if you will, the doctrine, kind of figures out the tenets of faith. Not the tennis of faith, but the tenets of the faith, all right? And has a mindset, which we could really say is the set of beliefs or assumptions or presuppositions that a person has about what's real. And, an evangelist is an outgrowth of a person. I was considered to be an evangelist for a while. I defined myself as a youth evangelist. Now, today, Deanna, maybe you've heard this. The term evangelist is applied in business to describe somebody who's really a brand ambassador. Mm-hmm. I think the term may have been coined by a fellow by the name of Guy Kawasaki. Sounds like, the motorcycles. Mm. Guy Kawasaki, who in the 1980s was the brand ambassador for Apple products. And so that person is someone who's usually an individual who's very passionate and can go out and spread the beliefs of that company that to persuade people to purchase the products. So there's a very good talk on YouTube by someone named Simon Sinek with a K, who talks about this particular topic. It's well worth watching.
Yeah.
Just put in. Have you ever seen Simon Sinek at all?
I have, yes.
Okay, so you're a very literate person here. Great.
I have. I don't know if everyone else has, but I have, yeah.
He's well worth watching.
Right.
I've shown some of his content to my students. It has absolutely nothing to do with the Hebrew language, but I think it has everything to do. I'm very fascinated by what goes on behind people's eyes in terms of the psychology behind things. Mm-hmm. So. Because we're all being kind of manipulated in various ways by, people with messaging, especially today with social media. Now, a lot of people think of an evangelist. Certainly, I'm old enough now to remember the old days of. This is a little bit before my time, but there was someone named Oral Roberts. Mm-hmm. There's a university named Oral Roberts, up in Tulsa, not that far from you. And Oral Roberts, I remember his TV stuff back in the black and white days where he did the Sawdust Trail. They'd put up a tent and throw down sawdust, and people would come from miles around and hear these great messages, and they would all respond. And I remember Billy Graham crusades. I've been to at least 2 of those, I believe, in my day. also went to a leaders conference once at the big church in Garden Grove, Robert Schuler's place, where Billy Graham was teaching leaders. And he was everybody talked about Billy Graham crusades. Interesting word to use, by the way, when you study what the crusades really were.
That is kind of odd, actually. Yeah, you're right.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. Right. It's
crusading
really,
for Christ, right?
Right. It'd be like using the term, I don't know, we're gonna have a gospel blitzkrieg,
or an intifada.
Right. Gospel intifada. Oh, that phrase has never been uttered before. Wow. That's scary.
But if you think about it, it's sort of like right in the same lines of how Christianity they wear cross necklaces. The thing that killed their Messiah. It'd be like if he got killed if he got assaulted by a shotgun, they would wear a shotgun around their neck.
Gun, yeah.
It's really strange.
Or a knife, or
yeah.
Yeah, I'm from Virginia, so I'm familiar with all of that. All of that comes from.
Well, Billy Graham was from North Carolina,
right.
So not too far.
We had Pat Robertson not too far from me in Virginia
Beach. Sure. Well, I'm just funny you mentioned his name, and I start thinking of things I've known that he said, but. The idea of an evangelist is very embedded in American society. If you go back about 1730 to 1770, I think it was the time known as the Great Awakening. Anybody that studied American history will recall that period of time, at least as a chapter of something that you might have had to study in high school. Mm-hmm. And that's where some very prominent persons, like there was George Tenet, George Whitefield. The most famous name associated with, there's really two names. One was Jonathan Edwards, who preached you can go online and read the text known as Sinner, his best known sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Mm-hmm. Remember that? Mm-hmm. Right. Paralleling that was two brothers, John and Charles Wesley, who were Anglican ministers, Anglican priests, if you will, from the UK. They were John Wesley specifically was brought into the Georgia colony to bring a renewal in the Anglican Church to people there in Georgia. And that became known as the Methodists. The Methodist Church grew out of which is extremely liberal, kind of leftist-leaning church today. But in the early days of Methodism, today it's probably the Free Methodist Church that is more conservative. But the Methodists were in their earliest stages were very, pious people. All of this was sort of a derivative of the early Puritanism of the 1600s. But that's, again, this is just foundational. So evangelism and reaching out and preaching the gospel in various ways was an integral part of the development of American culture. About 100 years ago, there was a very colorful woman that founded the denomination that I was part of. Her name was Amy Semple McPherson, and she was the best show in town.
Wow.
She was a fiery young lady, very charismatic. I mean, in terms of personality, she was also very involved in the Pentecostal movement. From Western Canada, she came down. She married a fellow by the name of Robert Semple, who was a missionary to China. He unfortunately died. And she came to LA, and with her tent meetings and her very dynamic personality, she became a leader to tens of thousands, probably more than that, just tons and tons of people that came to her. She put on sacred operas, concerts, fiery sermons. She would do crazy things. So she'd dress up in a cop uniform and ride down the center aisle of Angelus Temple on a motorcycle and come up on the platform and say, "Stop in the name of the Lord."
Wow, she was a showman.
She was a big showman.
Wow.
My pastor from the old days in Oregon used to talk about her, and she would go up. She had a little storefront mission type of thing down in like the Bowery of Los Angeles, and she'd go outside and stand on a chair, looking up at the roof of the building. She'd just stand there, look, and people would gather around. So, what is she looking at? And people would more and more curiosity seekers would show up, and then she would look at the crowd and say, "Quick, follow me! Quick, inside here!" And she'd take them all inside, lock the door, and preach to them. That was her crazy way of doing things. I mean, she was just a wacko when it comes to her strategies. But she ended up building about a 5,000-seat auditorium in Echo Park on the edge of what was downtown LA in those days, and she was very, very successful. And I came from I went to the Bible college that she created. So from her, and of course, if you read the story of her life, it's laced with intrigue and subterfuge, and there are those who say she might have taken herself into the next world by an overdose of sleeping pills. I mean, a lot of uncertainty about her. Billy Graham, of course, was the most pristine of the evangelists and best known and best loved. He was considered the preacher to so many different presidents. I remember watching in the stadium as the choir sang, just as I am without one plea. And hundreds of people would come down to the front and make their commitment to be born again. So it's a big part of Protestant Christianity, especially conservative Christianity, fundamentalist Christianity, to preach. That's known in the Greek language. It's called the kerygma, the proclamation. Preaching, how are they going to hear except they have to have a preacher, and somebody has to be sent, Paul says. So the whole idea of sending people out, this kind of missionary approach. Now, a missionary could, in traditional terms, a missionary is somebody who goes from maybe one country to another country and sets up shop there, right, and stays for a long time. I knew missionaries when I was living in Israel. I was very close to some missionaries from the Nazarene Church, the Church of the Nazarene, as it was called.
Right.
Merlin and Alice Hunter, who were missionaries from California in the Arab sector of the city of Nazareth. I was very close to them and stayed with them for a while. Earl and Norma Morgan, their counterparts in East Jerusalem. I knew very well-known Dr. Robert Lindsay, who was the head of the former head of the Southern Baptist Mission in Israel, and one of the big advocates of the primacy of Luke as far as the Gospels were concerned. We've had many conversations here on Tanakh Talk about Mark being the first Gospel, right, and then parts of that being sprinkled into Matthew and Luke. Dr. Lindsay used to talk about it being that Luke was the first, and behind Luke was what's known as a Q Gospel, because he translated the Greek into Hebrew and found things that were poor Greek but very good Hebrew. It'd be like if you were translating something from Spanish, and in the Spanish it says, "and he kicked the bucket."
Right.
Now, you and I would recognize that as an idiom from the English language,
right, of course,
which means he died. Okay,
right.
But if someone just took any of those phrases, it's raining cats and dogs, mm-hmm, right? We know that's an English language idiom. So I studied a bit under Dr. Lindsay and was fascinated by this whole thing. So my studies eventually brought me to some very different conclusions than what Dr. Lindsay had been advocating, and I understand that. Missionaries have, as we used this term the other night, Thursday night in Yerushalayim, missionaries have a bifurcated view of the world. It's black, it's white, it's on, it's off, you're in, you're out, it's heaven or hell. So bifurcated means split into two. And my motivation as a missionary, because I lived in Israel for 4 years, I learned Hebrew, and my goal was to communicate to Israelis, primarily secular Israelis, not religious Israelis, that they'd missed their Messiah. And
right.
I remember one night talking with and it's interesting because I just visited this kibbutz last week. I went specifically to the graveyard, the cemetery, to get the names of people that I had known, because I'm sure that no one has ever studied something for them or said Kaddish for the yard site, and I wanted to make sure I could do that. I remember one time speaking to a German Holocaust survivor in that kibbutz. It was the night before I was ejected for missionary activity, as a matter of fact, 1977. And I remember talking to this fellow, David Green, and he said, if there is a personal God, I would have to hate him because he stood by and did nothing while my families perished in the Hitler's ovens.
Right.
And I had no answer for him other than just to say, well, you have to understand the nature of evil and the work of the devil. But even as the words came out of my mouth saying it was all attributed to this Satan figure, it just felt like I was, there's a wonderful Yiddish word to describe what I was doing, ploppling. To plopple is just to sort of mouth words, but they're just vapid and void of any real significance. And I felt like I was ploppling when I look back at it. But again, to me, you're either You're either saved or you're unsaved. You're going to heaven or you're going to hell. And my job was to somehow soften your heart through my good works or my friendly approach to you, if you will. I'd studied the book by Rebecca Pippert that came out in the 70s called Out of the Salt Shaker Into the World, which was about a concept known as friendship evangelism. Because the tough guy approach of meeting people on the street and giving them a blunt message of, you better turn or burn,
right.
that wasn't to what the missiologists would later call from Fuller Seminary seeker sensitive. And people wanted to build church growth out of something that was more appealing to the natural curiosity that people had about how they become better people.
Right.
And I think a very good example of that, again, not too far from you, is Joel Osteen.
Oh yeah.
Right. So he really, and building on the work that his father did, he really created something that was kind of like Robert Schuller did 40 years before him in Garden Grove Community Church. He gave a message that everybody could hear, but inside that church is a mechanism where you start out and think of like a funnel, and you've got a very wide end there that anybody and everybody could sort of fall into, and then as they sort themselves out and come to deeper and deeper levels of commitment as they proceeded through the funnel into it's like almost like an assembly line, if you will. I remember at Garden Grove where I was there and I studied in seminars what they did. And it was a selection process. And people sorted themselves out based on how they were being led by their own compelling self-interest for spiritual growth and personal growth. So it's this bifurcation, by the way, of this splitting the world into two hemispheres. It is not just characteristic of fundamentalist Christianity. It's also characteristic of, let's say, Islam. We mentioned this also, and I didn't get really much time to expound on this, but not only did I live in Israel for 4 years, I spent about 6 months working across the border from Israel in South Lebanon. I was a radio broadcaster back in the days when we had High Adventure radio station functioning as a communication tool, originally for Christians in the south of Lebanon. Their leader wanted to communicate with his followers up in the north, but also someone by the name of George Otis, a very good friend of Pat Boone, who was part of the church that I went to in Los Angeles. They were able to do Christian broadcasting on that station. So about half the day, the programming was in Arabic, and the other half of the day was programming, and you like this, it was country music, a lot of country music. So, and then sprinkle. It was really funny.
Shannon, are you getting this? Just ask.
Well, she would be she'd be proud.
She would be very proud.
And I used to do weekend shifts. I'd leave the kibbutz after dinner on Friday night, put on my flak jacket, take the company van, and drive across the border. Somewhere I still have my military pass to go into South Lebanon. And I drove into some very dangerous territory. Shouldn't have been there at one level, but it was scary. I mean, we had bad people in that area. Eventually, the radio station was blown up by a Syrian suicide bomber or something. Wow. But I wasn't there that night. And the whole impetus of that was to get the gospel into the Middle East, and this way we could get it right down into all of northern Israel on AM radio, and then shortwave all over the Middle East. But that's also the same time, I mentioned I was 6 months in Lebanon. I also lived 2 years in Saudi Arabia as a teacher in a Saudi Navy Technical Institute of Naval Studies, teaching Saudi cadets, prepping them for more technical courses by giving them basic English. That's where I started learning more and more about Islam itself. And I went deeper and deeper. My students used to say to me all the time in Saudi Arabia, "Mr. Sanders, you good man, why you no Muslim?" And we had interesting conversations about why I wasn't a Muslim. But the more I studied about Islam, the more I could see that it was very much this is a terrible comparison. But I heard Rabbi Shulman refer to this in another context today, listening to yesterday's broadcast. It's kind of like Mr. Potato Head. You put various pieces together from different sources. It's really the technical term for this in psychological terms is syncretism. In Judaism, we call it a cholent. It's like a casserole. Mm-hmm. Little bit of this, a little bit of that. Because you can see within Islam, you can see Christian influences, Jewish influences, Zoroastrian influences, pre-Islamic influences. as well as some things that are certainly unique to the Prophet Muhammad. But the thing I wanted to point out here is that the Islamic view of the world being bifurcated is there's what's known as the house of war and the house of peace. You've heard those terms before?
I have. Not real familiar with it, but yes.
So they call it the word dar in Arabic means like house. It's interesting because it's related to a Hebrew word, which like the word diur or dira. A dira is like an apartment. It has to do with a dwelling place.
Oh yeah, right.
So there's dar al-Islam and dar al-Harb. Harb is the word for war. It's related to a Hebrew word cherev. You can hear the relationship cherev and harb. Cherev in Hebrew means sword. Mm-hmm. And so how was war conducted? Basically, it was conducted with a sword. And of course, the Islamic symbol for what do you see on the flag of Saudi Arabia? You see what's known as the Shahada, which is the proclamation there is no God but Allah, and who his prophet is. And then you see the sword. So the job of the House of Islam is to subdue the house of war. And that can be done through jihad. And there are various forms of jihad. You know, there's the part that we all dislike very much, which is done by hurting people, individuals, massive numbers of people. There's also something known as economic jihad, which any of us who are old enough to remember the gas lines of 1973 and then again in 1978, where in the days of odd and even in America, where we had to wait sometimes for hours. You know, if your license plate ended with a 1, that you had Monday and Wednesday, so that whole thing. That was a form of economic jihad. And then there's even something known as architectural jihad, where if you go to a place like Rome or any of the major European cities, any of even the largest mosque there, the minaret, what's like with the spire, will be higher than any other religious building that's there, whether it's Christian or Jewish, whatever. That's kind of an architectural jihad, that it has to be higher, it's have superiority.
It's kind of like it's kind of like in the temple days where, you had the high priest who would never lift his hands above his head because on his head had the sacred tetragrammaton of the Creator. So nothing could go higher than that. So he had the ramp, and where he would climb up on the ramp, so everything was below that. So similar concept, right?
Yes,
okay.
It's a good comparison.
Okay.
So coming all the way back around to where we were, the missionary worldview is that there is no righteous action that any person can do to be saved or procure God's favor, because they're doomed. You know, if anybody who knows Calvinism remembers the acronym TULIP, the first of John Calvin's 5 principles was T stands for total depravity. All people are horribly corrupt and incapable of doing anything to better themselves. It's interesting how much this flies in the face of the messages of the major prophets. If you open up Isaiah chapter 1, he gives a whole list of things he says that we're supposed to do that are emblematic of having done what's called tshuva, or repentance. People are capable of doing tshuva. You know, it's
right.
Rend your heart, not your garments.
Right.
You know, it's my favorite one I like to quote, because back in my days we had a whole musical based on this verse, 2 Chronicles chapter 7 verse 14. If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and turn from their wicked ways, then I'll hear from heaven, forgive their sin and heal their land. This is God speaking to the Jewish people. And there's nowhere in there anything about blood sacrifice or waiting for JC to show up to be the shock absorber for their sins. He says, humble yourselves, pray, turn from your wicked ways. Well, if you are totally depraved, totally corrupt and incapable, why would God give you an instruction affecting your behavior that you couldn't do?
Right.
So,
by the way, Shannon says, I caught all that. Glad to know Gavriel is familiar with little honky tonk.
You can let her know. She's listening now, is she?
She is. Yes, she is.
All right. So just, okay, Shannon, I have been to Gillies and rode the mechanical bull for about 49 seconds. So I've got the picture to prove it. So right before I was tossed. So that was quite a night. So the missionary appeals to the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world, John chapter 2. Those who have come to believe and are saved have an imperative to share this message with other people that have not. This was the big driving force in my life for a number of years, many, many years actually, starting from the time when I was 16. Mark chapter 14 says, I think it's about verse 24 through 26, says that this gospel of the kingdom must be proclaimed throughout all the world as a witness to all the earth,
right,
and then the end will come, right? So anybody who's focused on eschatology, the doctrine of last things, knows the imperative of reaching the world. And I actually worked for an organization that had that goal in view with getting gospel literature to every home on earth. It was this was long before the internet. But they were going to villages in the most remote places, wherever, and translating the gospel messages into very obscure languages, working closely with Wycliffe Bible translators and other groups to literally fulfill that by getting to the ends of the earth, every home, every person. In fact, it was all organized under the heading of something called Every Home Crusade. And that whole effort, by the way, for a long time, especially under the Catholic Church, and then after the breakaway of the Protestant Revolution, reaching the world wasn't such a big deal until somebody by the name of William Carey in the early 1800s came and began to persuade his British colleagues that God really cares about the heathen out in India. They weren't just to be exploited for their tea and their rice, but they were really the candidates for the gospel. I actually went to do my graduate work at something called William Carey International University in Pasadena, California, which was organized under the umbrella of the U.S. Center for World Mission, started by Dr. Ralph Winter. I mention these names because anybody in the church that's watching this should understand that I know what I'm talking about. I know where I'm coming from. I was associated with people that were really at the hub of making these things happen. So it's just it's the last place on earth that I expect it to be. Living under a yarmulke.
Right.
I went to the U.S. Center. Went to William Carey International University to get credentialed in teaching English as a second language, so I could use that as what would be Paul called it, tent making. Paul made tents to support himself and his disciples. Tent making was a big thing where people having professions that would put them in different countries so they could be self-supporting missionaries.
You want to hear something?
Want
to hear something interesting?
Yeah.
The Messianics will teach, at least one sect of them does, that his tent was not making tents; it was actually making talitot.
Oh,
interesting, right?
Well, as they say down where you are, I had never heard that one. Okay, making talitot. Now, since he was the apostle to the Gentiles, he's selling these talitot to
as memorabilia, maybe.
Maybe so. Interesting.
Okay.
Some people who watch the program.
Gavriel.
Yes, is there a question?
Yep.
So this actually came up on Tanakh Talkers at one point. I think it was Sadik asked the question, like, what happens to people who are not reached? Like, they've never heard the gospel.
Like the pygmies in New Guinea, or that's just a rough example.
Like, what happens to them? What belief did your missionary? What was the?
It's a great question because we brought this up in Bible college, and I think it might have come up also at William Carey. We had some great people of note who came in to teach each week for us in the missiology classes I took there. It might have been Dr. David Hesselgrave from Trinity in Deerfield, Illinois, that fielded this. We took this question. He said, again, I'm attributing to him, but it's been a long time. He said, people will be judged. Those who've never heard the gospel will be judged by what they did with the light that they had. And that inside of every person, there's something called conscience.
Right.
And people will then be judged by what they did with their conscience. Well, if that's the case, then why do we need this over here? It's
exactly. That, I think what Sadik was saying, I think it was Sadik, I'll have to go back to, he'll correct me on the chat if he's there, is so great. They've lived a good life. They've never heard the message. You're going to go then bring the message to them and they have now a choice of either accepting it or rejecting it. And if they reject it, they're going to hell.
Right.
So you're really not doing them any favors.
Right.
True.
That's correct. And I've heard so many things of recent here on Tanakh Talk, as I'm a big fan of the program and try to listen as much as I can. Like most of us, I'm really, really busy, but the information flow here is extremely meaningful to all of us. So let me put my train of thought back on here for a second. So, but anything of other questions that come up or comments you want, please insert those. I believed in the Pauline priority that's mentioned that the gospel should go to the Jew first and also to the Greek.
Right.
I believe that Jewish evangelism, reaching the Jewish people, was the summum bonum, as they say in Latin, the highest good that a person could engage in. I built my whole life around the fulfillment of the Great Commission, which is not an insurance transaction, but the fulfillment of Matthew 14, as we just mentioned, and Matthew chapter 28 and Luke 21, that this reaching the world was what we all had to be involved in, and because the great king was supposed to come back, and if I didn't do what I was doing, I was really I was holding up the program, So going to Israel to reach the Jewish people in whatever way I could, learning Hebrew, dialoguing with them, sharing with them a message of reconciliation and of restoration, showing some apology for what had been done in the name of Christianity, in the name of the founder of Christianity, if you will, for the horrible things that happened to the Jewish people. Of course, we wrote about that. I had newsletters, whatever, that shared this idea that Christians of today owed a debt to the Jewish people for the transgressions of Christians in the past. And as we know, for most of Christian history, Jews were sidelined by a doctrine that was sanctioned called supersessionism, and we talked about that last week as well. And I've heard Rabbi Singer and Rabbi Shulman, of course, have talked also about the idea that the church was the new Israel, and that the church age was the age of salvation, and Jews had to suffer, and that the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD and in 135 AD, or as we say CE, that these were emblematic of the Creator's ultimate rejection of the covenant and the people of that covenant. So Jews simply were doomed to suffer. But they would eventually have a part in the final redemption at the end of time. And that teaching is very traceable in the first 500 years of the Christian church. And I came across this interesting 26-page study I mentioned last week. And if someone's interested in obtaining that 26-page study, then just send me an email, Gavriel Sanders at Gmail. You'll see it on the screen at some point. And then we're happy to do that. It's very important, whether you're still in the church or recently came out or never went in, but you're interested in these subjects. I think it's very important for you to read this document and read the quotes of the early church fathers, particularly those who were the post-apostolic fathers, right after the disciples, going all the way up into the 4th and 5th centuries. Martin Luther tried to change the status of the Jews after he broke with the Catholic Church, and he hung his 95 Theses on the Wittenberg door in October 31st of 1517, I think it was. And he figured out, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and I don't like the Catholic Church. The Jews don't like the Catholic Church. Let's be friends, right? But the Jews were stubborn in the resistance to Martin Luther's overtures, and 20 years later he changed his tune, and we all know exactly what happened. I mean, I've heard Rabbi Singer talk about it many times, the vitriol that Martin Luther unleashed against the Jews, saying that property should be confiscated, they should be denied the opportunity to make a living, they should be rounded up in their synagogues and burned. I mean, it was pretty horrible stuff, which became part of the basis for the Nazis, Yamach Shema, may their names be exterminated, to get rid of this, what they call cursed people. So a lot's been said on this subject. I won't belabor that point. I'm just passing a few of the facts. Important to recognize, and if anybody can find this book, I held it up last week, by Yaakov with a K, Ariel, called Evangelizing the Chosen People, Missions to the Jews in America from 1880 to the year 2000. That's a very seminal book to read, which gives a lot of information on the mission efforts, the early mission efforts 100 years ago, especially in this country, and then even the work of the Narkey Street Baptist Church, which I was part of for a short time, learning under Dr. Lindsay. If you want to get a better understanding of the relationship between dispensationalism and Jewish evangelism today, or the precursor personalities that led to the formation of Jews for J or Chosen People Ministries, a lot of that is in that book. You got to read it. There's some pretty chilling stuff on page 116 and 17, which is worth reading. Now, again, personally, I came from a spiritually nowhere kind of home.
Yep.
I had a little bit of Catholic education. God to me was really Godzilla, angry, fire breathing, don't get too close. Deanna likes that.
Also Catholic.
At 15, I was running the streets, dropped out of high school. Later on, I think it was somewhere in there, pretty soon after all that, somebody introduced me to you remember the little butterscotch booklet called Four Spiritual Laws? Which was by Bill Bright. Remember him, Campus Crusade?
Mm-hmm.
I was introduced to, it was a little church up in Dallas. In fact, it happened up in Dallas to the north of you. Schofield Memorial Baptist Church.
Oh.
No, that wasn't, no, not Baptist. Schofield Memorial Church. It was non-denominational. And they got me into the youth group there. And I remember one night going in there on a Sunday evening or whatever, and some preacher was speaking, a missionary was there speaking, and he spoke on Isaiah chapter 6. Who will go for us, and who will I send? Now, I knew nothing. I just heard this stirring message, and he said, if you're willing to go for God and you're willing to reach the world, that sounded good to me. It was better than running the streets, being a little doper kid. So I went home and told my mom that I stood up at church tonight, and I'm going to be a missionary. My mother said the words I least wanted to hear. Don't you think you should finish high school first? No, Mom, there's no time. The Lord is coming back. I got to go out and
the end is near.
I had no idea what the word was, but it just it sounded
Right.
like an exciting thing to go do.
Right.
And these were the days. Again, some listeners will remember there was an offshoot of before the off. There was a big church in Costa Mesa, California, called Calvary Chapel. In those days, it was a little church. In fact, there was a song by a band called Love Song, Little Country Church on the Edge of Town. And it was about Calvary Chapel that exploded into a church of 35,000 people. And they planted all kinds of offshoot efforts, one of which was a communal network called the House of Miracles. And in Riverside, California, when I migrated to there from Texas, I got involved in that. And it was it was the weirdest bunch of people. There were 50 men and women living together in a house. There were dormitories,
Wow.
very segregated. It was very a very Haredi environment, if you will. It was very, we all we lived for was the second coming. We got together for Bible studies and prayer groups, and we were preaching on the streets and the campuses and down at the beach, wherever we could go, malls. We were telling everybody everywhere, if we could just buttonhole them long enough to listen to us. They were bikers and long hairs and musicians. These were the days of Maranatha music and artists. I mentioned Love Song, Debbie Kerner, Mustard Seed Faith, all kinds of groups. There was that really weird counterculture guy, Larry Norman, who sang the song, Life is filled with guns and war. And
Yeah.
I wish we'd all been ready. I don't know if you remember that.
Yeah.
One.
Yeah. Totally. I used to
extra
actually sing that song as part of one of my gigs that we did with the Christian rock band. Yeah.
Interesting. So these mega churches that happened, I was part of one in Eugene, Oregon called Faith Center.
DC Talk, by the way, DC Talk.
Oh, right.
There you go.
I was part of one in L.A. and these mega churches, spawned many daughter churches across the country. And there was this end time fervor that was so contagious, and the book industry was pumping out things like the best known one is The Late Great Planet Earth by Hal Lindsey. Which is millions and millions of copies. I met him a few years ago at a book conference. But and this was the sign you would see. Everybody was going around, one way. And there was a campaign in 1973 called Key 73. There was the first time that 800 numbers were used extensively was in an evangelical missionary outreach called I Found It. And the big big billboards all around the country. I found it. They gave it 800 number you can call. What did you find? I found New Life in JC. So I had a freshman evangelism class that required us to be part of that whole thing. And what do we have to do? We had to use the telephone book and go call people up cold calling people to talk to them about the gospel. Right. And I got smart because I think I had a way of finding it an easier way. So since my last name was Sanders, I would look up people in the white pages. Their last name is Sanders. So I instantly had a connection with them, right? Yeah. Hi, is this Bill Sanders? Hey, this is so-and-so Sanders. I had another name in those days. And I just wanted to ask you a question. Could I share? I happen to be a believer. You may not be, but could I just share something meaningful I found in the Bible that just as one Sanders to another Sanders? See how that worked?
Yeah, absolutely. Well played.
So, and I would talk to them about my faith, and then the whole idea was to get to pray with that person and maybe follow up and send them literature, whatever. These were some of the things that were going on at that time, and many of these old hippies, I mean these young hippies in those days are old preachers today. Around the country.
Okay, so, real quick, Gavriel, we're about 5 minutes till an hour. Regarding your closing comments for your trip to Israel, is there anything that you might want to make sure you get in tonight that you haven't already?
Yes, I think that the thing that viewers should understand is that much activity has happened in Israel over the last particularly 20 years to soften the historical resistance of the Israeli government and certain agencies that feed into and serve the Israeli government, especially with things like Aliyah, that to soften the resistance to the message, because the Christian Zionists have figured out that through political support and charitable support, there's so much receptivity. Everyone's saying today, well, the Christians are the best friends that we have. And by the way, I think that's true. I don't deny that. And it's amazing to me how much Christian giving, charitable giving, can even outstrip that of other, traditional Jewish sources. We were talking about this at the Shabbat table that I was sharing with others in Jerusalem just 2 days ago. People brought up at the table, said, well, what's the alternative? You just shut off the support. Well, if you're a guy running, you're a rabbi somewhere running a soup kitchen that feeds, 500 people a week.
Right.
And you're taking this money, and all of a sudden you find out these people really have missionary intention. Well, if you say no to the money, what are you going to say to 500 people that eat by you? What are you going to do? So there's a third, we called them silos. There's a third silo of support that's coming in now through Israel, through these Christian agencies, especially Christian Zionist agencies, that is now supporting what's known as the indigenous Messianic Church. There are a lot of Israeli, if you will, Israeli Messianic fellowships dotted around the country that are doing the frontline work of evangelizing because they're Israelis, or they came in, they made Aliyah, somehow they got in, and they're there and they're functioning. So the Christian Zionists can have plausible deniability over the issue of missionizing by saying, oh, we don't missionize. Yet there's a very traceable paper trail that shows otherwise when you look at the ultimate results, the groups that are being supported. And there are a number of these things that I really shouldn't and won't talk about, but anything I'm referring to can be substantiated. And these are days that are efforts being made to bring these things to the awareness of people that need to be aware of them,
right?
So that things can come to some kind of a positive change. Nobody's asking for the kindness of the Christian community to be turned off. I am interested, by the way, and notice that Christians are very interested in Jews, in the Jewish homeland. Not particularly, they're interested in Judaism to kind of pick and choose pieces that they like. But when it comes down to real Torah observance and things, they don't like that. And we talk about rabbinic Judaism, don't like that. And yet this is the only consistent stream of Judaism that's existed. So I think that the two things of drawing red lines and setting up, people who are educated. I think Shannon's one of those people who are educated to be able to speak the language of both groups, because this is probably the biggest single falling out point.
Right.
We mentioned this also the other night. Jews in Israel, especially in government positions, and Christian Zionists who come to Israel, use terms for which they don't have a common dictionary. Mm-hmm. And so we need to open that up and make both groups literate, and also for the Christian Zionists to understand, I know what you mean when you say Bible and Messiah and redemption and salvation, and it's not what Judaism has
right.
historically talked about.
They've hijacked all the terms and made their own definitions from them all.
Precisely right. So I just wanted to bring these things out a little bit, to give some references.
Okay.
And I'm not the only person in this milieu who to walk this path. There are certainly other amazing candidates, people who know these things, and Baruch Hashem, there's a coalition, there's a coming together of different people from different streams, really, to work on this, so that the truth is happening. There's been so much obfuscation, subterfuge in the name of reaching the Jewish people, and on the other side, the recipients who have I guess kind of been guilty of altering the way they speak to make the Christians think, well, we're kind of leaning toward you, mm-hmm. we're really more sure. like you than right. not like you, when there's really a huge gap between the two that needs to be respected. I heard a woman named Manette Mayberg from the Mayberg Foundation that gives a lot of money for Jewish Education Project. She gave a definition, which she's a one-word definition about the Jewish people. So the word is distinct. Mm-hmm. Distinct. Right. And there's an effort now, I think, through the Christian Zionist movement, without unknowingly and maybe unintentionally, because of the Pauline theology that says ultimately there's supposed to be one new man from the Jewish community, from the Gentiles, to make of the Jew. Because what does Paul say? There's no Jew, there's no Greek, there's no male, there's no female, there's no slave, there's no free. Messiah, right? They're all one new man, right? One new man in you know who. And so, to me, I'm going to use a Star Trek analogy. That sounds like the Borg.
Yeah, that's true. Well, the cyborg,
right?
Action. Yeah, right.
Resistance is futile, and it's just like this. We're going to take all. So, losing the uniqueness and the distinction of the Jewish people. The great Israeli entertainer, actor, singer, philosopher, if you will, Yoram Gaon said in an article some years ago, here's the Israeli dilemma. We want to be a people like all the peoples, but the moment we become such, we will cease to be. It sounds much better in Hebrew. And so for those Hebrew speakers amongst us, I'll say it slowly. Hine abaya, אנחנו רוצים להיות עם כמו כל העמים. אבל ברגע שנהיה כך, לא נהיה. And it's very, those are very weighty words that have to be put out there. And he's saying the Ladino-speaking community, everybody knows him, big, well-known singer. And so these are things that we're working on. I just want to kind of bring this out without the disruption of the group that we had last week. There's a lot more to say on this subject, some other points that we can data mine, but data mining is one of the things that's happening right now from both the Christian Zionists and from the Messianic community, where they're going through Jewish sources, particularly the Gemara these days, trying to prove that traditional rabbinic Judaism is wrong, and somehow they're right.
Right.
Unfortunately, they didn't leave a paper trail, and our people did. So on that note, you can bring up the music I hear in the background. Thank you for this. Thank you for this time.
Academy Award.
Yeah, thank you for.
Bravo, my dear brother Gavriel Sanders. You're amazing, Tzaddik.
I hope this was really useful to people. I really do.
Absolutely.
Very much so. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your work you've done in Israel and also your follow-up here, as well as your weekly shows that you do here on the Wow and How of Hebrew, which will continue next week, Hashem willing.
I'm looking forward.
We are all definitely looking forward to that too. Thank you so much, my dear brother. Y'all have a great night, and we'll see you soon.
Blessed.
We got one more show tonight, starting here in about 25 minutes with Rabbi Stuart Federow, so don't miss it. Peace out, y'all. Take care. Shalom.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Shalom.
כולם ביחד, חשוב מכל חשוב והכרחי להיות ביחד. איפוק זו העוצמה